garage door with a hanging stick figure, like a hangman, and the puzzle has 3 letters. The first letter is Y, and the last is a U. So now they shot me, and I guess they want to hang me. Perfect. I, of course, call the police. They arrive, question the neighbors, who naturally either weren't home or saw nothing. They take a statement, and then they actually help me clean the paint off. The officer helping me says, "Hey, this must have just happened, being the paint is still wet enough to be removed." The GoPro! His remark prompts me to remember taking the other officer up on his suggestion, and I had borrowed my cousin's GoPro the day before. We look at it, and now we have video of 2 guys walking up to my house in broad daylight and spray painting it. Problem was, you don't see them actually spray paint it, and they were wearing V for Vendetta masks. The officer takes the camera from me, well, from my cousin, and I guess they have something to go on. One step closer. Saturday, my friend Mike asked me to go to dinner with him, but I feel like I need to sit home and guard my house. He offers to drive, so it'll look like I'm home, but I really don't want to leave my house unattended, so we decide instead to have a barbecue at my house and have a few beers. We were sitting in my backyard, cooking up a couple of burgers and having a beer, when I see something out of my peripheral vision that makes me almost shit my pants. I see a guy in a V for Vendetta mask walking from the side of my house. I yell out, "Shit! Mike, watch out!" The guy doesn't do anything. He just does a one-fingered follow me motion. I will follow you. In fact, I'm gonna grab the tongs I use for meat and plunge them into your head if I can get over to you fast enough. Mike says, "Let's kick his ass," and grabs a folding chair. This, believe it or not, scares the guy into running to my front yard. We run after him, and he sprints towards, you guessed it, the white town car, and it's parked in the street right in front of my house. I run for the car, and the V points behind me, making me look over my right shoulder. As I do, another guy in another V mask is standing near my car on the driveway, and he bashes in the windshield with a tire iron. We run after him, and he sprints off around the block. We decide, forget it, let's go after the town car instead. We start running towards it, and one of the other guys in the back seat, wearing the same V mask, rolls down the window and shows me that he's got a gun. I have no idea if it's real or another paintball gun, but it looks real. We don't mess around, and we hightail it back to my backyard and then into my house. But this time, Mike got a look at the license plate. He immediately writes down the number as I look outside. The car is gone. Mike and I, once again, call the police, and they arrive in about 6 to 7 minutes. We give them the plate number, but naturally, those plates are stolen. Another dead end. Finally, I guess I'm becoming a priority, and the police agree to stake out my house. They sit down my block in a black Ford Explorer, which you would never know is a police vehicle, for 2 days. Monday night, I get a knock at the door, and I slowly look outside. It's an undercover officer. I know, because I know all of them by now. I open my door for him, and he tells me that a person was walking up to my house with a letter, and it was a 15-year-old kid. The kid explains that he was given $150 to just knock on my door and hand me a letter, and he describes the guys who paid him and lets us know that they met just 10 minutes ago at the 7-Eleven by my house. They told the kid that they were with a law firm and were trying to serve me with legal documents, but couldn't do it themselves because I know their faces and wouldn't answer for them. The kid then says, "You know, like the Pineapple Express, man." The kid's story turns out to be legit, but one detail they overlooked. The 7-Eleven has cameras. The detective goes to the 7-Eleven and looks at the footage. It turns out to be grainy, but this time, we got the real plates. Now the police know who the owner of the town car really is. They link it back to a guy that I've never heard of, who surprisingly lives not too far from me. The officers go to the house and arrest the man. It turns out, it's the old man I had originally saw the first night I got shot with the paintballs. He was home alone, but luckily, a few minutes later, the other 4 guys were pulled over about 2 blocks away in the town car. One of the other guys in the group is a kid I went to school with, Eric. A kid who used to get bullied a lot, and believe it or not, I used to stick up for. It turns out, these guys were all living together in this house. Our theories were completely wrong. None of them were teenagers at all. All of these guys are ages ranging from 35 through 48. But here's the really scary part. The part that makes me lose sleep. Inside their house, they found a meth lab, an arsenal of weapons, and over $50,000 in cash, and a dead homeless man. They had chained him to a wall by his neck and shoulders and used him as target practice, painting him up to look like a clown. Above him, written on the wall, were the words, "Shoot the geek." The homeless man had been dead for several days, and it was determined that he was killed by a combination of internal injuries, starvation, and from bleeding out. These monsters had cut off his hands and one of his feet. These sick freaks let a person starve in their basement while they beat him to death and dismembered him. The police determined that this was most likely not their first time they had murdered someone, with 98% statistical certainty. From what I derived, if they would have gotten me captured in their home, it wouldn't have been their last time either. When word got out that the kid I went to high school with was linked to this story, it prompted a lot of people to talk about him, and sadly me, on social media. Several people I hadn't spoken to since graduation started contacting me. One being a girl that I had went to school with, who claimed that back in 2000, Eric had raped her. It was dismissed as a typical he said, she said case. I, like everyone else, never knew this happened. She thanked me for helping to put him away. Another person, Kyle, had told me that him and Eric had gotten into a bar fight back in 2003. Eric had started the fight over a game of pool, and Kyle believed that after that evening, Eric was damaging his car at night, keying it and flattening his tires, but he could never prove it. Eric is serving a staggering, but appropriate, 52-year sentence for felony murder, home invasion, criminal stalking, criminal trespassing, accessory to murder, vandalism, and driving a car with a stolen license plate, as well as several other charges. If he survives prison, he will be 87 when he breathes his first breath of freedom again. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe so you can catch all of my future content. If you'd like to talk to me on a more personal level, make sure you go like my Facebook page. Feel free to send me a message on there, even just to say hi. And just remember, it's always scarier if it's true. This story was submitted by Cinderella 1975. This happened to me 2 summers ago, on my way home from an out-of-town day trip for my son's birthday party. We went to a water park and decided to go to dinner in this really small town after getting slightly lost due to Google Maps' crappy directions. After dinner, we noticed across the street there was a county fair, so we decided to check it out for fun. It was getting dark, and the fair was nearly over, but we caught a tractor pull that was about to begin. We'd never been to one, so we thought it might be a fun way to top off the birthday trip. We sat in the bleachers and watched for a while. It was kind of cool. Loud, but cool. There were a lot of families there watching, and also some drunk men watching as well. I did not think anything of it. I had my 16-year-old son with me and a good friend of mine who is a strong guy, so I felt safe. Backtracking using Google Maps directions, we got on the road that I recognized would get us home. I noticed that as soon as we pulled out of the restaurant, there was a car behind me. The only car on the road, as most of the town inhabitants were most likely at the fair or at home. The car followed us on the road we took to get home, which I found odd because it was a desolate back hilly road with a wooded area on either side. I thought maybe they too were from out of town and were using the same cut across to get to the interstate, as it was summer and many people road trip. I still felt uneasy about it, but decided to just get off this podunk road and onto the interstate as soon as possible. As we were driving on this hilly back road, it was fully dark outside, and I kept it easy for fear of a deer running out in front of us. The car stayed right behind me. I slowed way down, hoping he would be annoyed enough to pass me for going too slow. Instead, he drove right up on my ass, tailgating me. I could see that it was only one person in the car, and the windows were tinted. I dared to speed up, wanting to get on the main road or interstate as soon as I could. He stayed right behind me. I dared to speed up, wanting to get to the main road or interstate as soon as I could. He stayed right behind me, going as fast or as slow as I was, not bothering to get off my bumper. I knew without a doubt we were being harassed now. I was getting scared. I had my son in the back seat. It was his birthday. This was unfair, and I kicked myself for going to the tractor pull. Of course, I could not have predicted this craziness. After what seemed like ages, we got onto the interstate. I had hoped it was just some local jerk who wanted to scare some city folks, but I somehow knew it was not that simple. As I feared, he followed us on the interstate. Even on the interstate, he tailgated us. I slowed down initially, hoping futilely he'd pass us. No luck. I sped way up. He caught up and stayed too close. Unfortunately, the interstate was quiet on our side. I had no choice but to keep going. My friend was very angry and ready to fight if necessary, but I wanted no part of meeting this guy face to face, especially with my birthday boy in the back seat. I just kept going and prayed not to get a flat tire. At one point, I got scared enough to lay on the horn while driving, hoping the noise would dissuade him. It worked. He pulled over to the shoulder, and I saw his headlights turn off. I was relieved at first, but we found it odd that he killed his lights. After that we sped up, and I was flying home. The sooner the better. About 15 minutes passed in blissful uneventfulness. We talked about how scary the whole ordeal was, and eventually started feeling relieved to put it all behind us, literally. We were about 25 minutes from home, and there were a couple of vehicles here and there, which made us feel less alone on the road. At one point when the cars thinned out, and we were once again alone on the road, something happened that I could not believe. Right next to us, and slightly behind us, bright headlights burst on. He had been following us the whole time, with his headlights off, staying carefully behind us and waiting for his chance to scare and surprise us. I almost started crying, but at this point, I was too angry. Far ahead of us, I saw the taillights of a semi. I sped up quickly, with the stranger in the car next to me trying to pace us in the fast lane. I think he realized that I was trying to catch up with the semi. So for the first time in this insane chase, he did something truly dangerous, and swerved at my rear panel. A pit maneuver, trying to push us off the road. I sped ahead and missed him, clipping me by inches. I finally reached the semi-driver and got close, hugging the back of his truck as much as I dared and leaving no room for this jerk to cut me off. We went this way for a little while. Finally, and I truly believe this semi-driver knew something was wrong, because after so long of seeing this crazy driver swerve at me and trying to get in front of me as I would not let him over, the semi-driver did something I will forever appreciate him for. He swerved into the fast lane and dangerously cut off the stranger's car, and then tapped the brakes. I took it as my cue to speed ahead from the slow lane and try to lose this creep. I sped up to 90, then 95. My hometown was straight ahead. I took a sharp left to a back street that leads to a main road and stopped at a busy, well-lit gas station. Luckily, there was a cop there. My friend got out and explained the whole situation to the officer, and he called for other cars to search for this guy. We left the gas station after calling a friend to follow me to a parking lot where I stowed my car overnight because I did not want the guy to possibly find my house by recognizing the car. I watched my back for quite some time after that. I always notice that make and model of a car in white if I see one on the streets. Thank goodness we got away safely. Now, the bothersome thing about this story is that the small town where this took place happens to be the small home of one of the biggest mental health facilities in Iowa. This thought has kept me awake more than one night, and I still check the papers for stories of escapees. Afterthought. In retrospect, I think of how I could have done things differently that night. Mostly, I'm just thankful we got away safely, if not a little spooked and a lot shook up. The police officer we spoke to told us that if anything should happen like that again, that I can call the police from the road, even if it's in the middle of nowhere, and that they will come to where we are to help. Duh, I never even thought of that. I guess in my panic, I just figured I had to get myself and my loved ones out of this, and that I would talk to the police once I was in town. But this advice could save someone else from going through this situation as long as we did. So please take this advice, and if ever in a frightening predicament in the middle of seemingly nowhere, don't hesitate to contact the police as soon as possible. This story was submitted by Lee Ramsey. This is my grandmother's story. She's never liked to talk about it with anyone outside of the family, and even then, apparently only the 1 or 2 times she's ever been drunk. When I asked her if she'd ever had any experiences like the ones on Let's Not Meet or the True Scary Stories threads on Reddit, she told me she had. I've been allowed to type this up and share it because she finally thinks it's been long enough since it happened. I don't have any news articles to attach. The reason will be made clear in the end, so I guess that's another reason to do things this way. It could all just be a family story in the end. First, a little background is required, I think. It happened when she was in her early 20s. Every summer, she went to go visit some relatives and friends in the interior of the country. While the connections are too complicated to explain here, my grandmother was closely related to a native group in the interior, and so she usually spent as much of her free time with her native half-siblings and cousins as often as she could. Since there was a limit on the choice of people to interact with, let alone befriend, there wasn't as much of a stigma against boys and girls forming friend groups together as usual back then. And so my grandma spent a lot of time with the other boys and the girls of the village when she was there. It's always hot in the interior, so a lot of the time, the team spent their days at the river and the small lakes to keep cool. Walking back to the main road from the closest river to the village took you past the local campgrounds. They filled up rather quickly in the summer and brought in traveling families and their own children and teens, which helped bolster the gaggles of kids running around and intermingling. So with that, I hope it explains what it was like there and why what happened was so strange. One summer was particularly hot. My grandmother and her friends were at the river cooling off with some of the campground kids. She'd brought her new bathing suit up from the city and had decided to pass it around. It was one of the first versions of the bikini that were out at the time, and everyone was having fun trying it on, and apparently the sight of her half-brothers in her bikini was absolutely hilarious. While sitting on one of the big rocks by the river with the others, my grandmother said she felt like she was being watched. Not the feeling you get when it's casual glances either, but the skin-crawling, very intense stare kind of feeling. Looking up, she couldn't really tell where it was coming from because of all the people on the river. When it didn't stop, she moved to another rock, but it didn't seem to help. Over the next few hours, she moved spots about 3 or 4 times, and eventually she just sat on the gravel of the beach in the shadow of one of the boulders. James was the leader of their village teen group, a handsome boy with long hair and really dark eyes. Whenever travelers came by, they'd always say that my grandmother and James were such a beautiful couple, and that they should get married. Locals always laughed at that, because besides them being cousins, something that was never told to outsiders was that James was actually what is now called the transgender. It wasn't really something that was openly talked about with outsiders. It was just something that was, because of traditional beliefs and all that in the native community. This is important for later on too. Anyway, James had apparently noticed my grandmother's moving around and came to sit next to her and ask her what was wrong. She explained the feeling, and James frowned and stood up to look around the river at the people hanging around. While women didn't have equality back then, as always, things were different in the boonies, and especially among the native communities, who tend to stick together because, as my grandmother put it, we never got help from anyone outside of the community. We had to rely on ourselves. No one took kindly to outsiders trying to get too close. When it got dark, everyone packed up and headed home, and while the feeling had faded, when my grandmother got to the main road, she said she felt it again. This continued on and off for a few days, even following her into town. At this point, all of her friends were on edge, especially when on the 3rd day of all of this, the girls of the group had gone over to my grandmother's and they'd found a letter addressed to my grandmother on the porch, detailing everything she'd done that day and with whom. This freaked them out, but they kept it to themselves and the group. The next day, while in town getting some ice cream, one of her cousins named Robert came running up to my grandmother and told her of a guy he'd seen watching her from behind the general store. He'd remembered what had been going on and called out to the guy, but when he'd done that, the stranger had turned around and run off. Robert had booked it after the guy, but had lost him at the edge of town where some of the hiking trails began. He said the stranger was white, pretty tall, but not all that rough looking like some of the transients they sometimes have coming through town. They knew that they couldn't go to the authorities with just that, which annoyed everyone more than anything else, but they all agreed it was better than nothing now, and they knew who to look for. That night, when my grandmother got home, she noticed someone had left her another letter on her doorstep. Inside was a poem talking about how much the sender loved her, and a lock of hair, which she assumed was the sender's. This scared her more than anything else, and she threw it all in the garbage. That night, she went to stay at James' place, too afraid to stay at home alone. She stayed there for 2 days, and everything seemed to go back to normal. No sightings and no feelings of being watched, much to her relief. On the 3rd day of staying with James, she was drinking some juice on the porch of James' house, waiting for him to get dressed so they could leave and go into town, when she saw some movement by the tree line at the edge of his property. A tall, white man walked out of the bush and just stood there, watching her. They stood there, frozen, and just watched each other for a moment before he smiled. Even from so far away, my grandmother knew that the smile was not a good one. My grandmother says that even today, she has nightmares about that smile. The man started walking towards her, and my grandmother screamed for James and dropped her cup, glass shattering around her feet. In the second or two that it took for that to happen, the man started to run towards her, and when my grandmother turned to bolt inside, she was shoved out of the way as James came barreling out. Looking back on it now, apparently the sight was somewhat comical, when removed from the abject terror that was running through my grandmother at the moment. There was James, only in a pair of pants that were still undone, with no shoes on, and standing in the juice and glass combo on his porch, apparently having been in the middle of binding, and was completely naked from the waist up, holding a gun. The intruder had stopped running when James came out, but then continued to move forward as he saw what he probably thought was only a woman with a gun, and probably thinking she couldn't shoot for a damn, as my grandmother put it. James sneered as the man continued on his property and leveled the gun and said loudly enough for the other man to hear, "Fence, planter," before letting off 2 successive shots. The wood of the old horse fence in the yard exploded, followed by one of the clay planters in the yard shattering behind the intruder as it was hit. The man flinched back a step, probably in surprise and realization that he'd just stepped into something that he couldn't handle. James calmly leveled the gun at the man and called out, "Head." The man turned and ran off into the trees again, disappearing from sight. My grandmother remembers crying for a while after that, shaken and terrified as James dragged her to the police station, only for her to have to pull him back out again to stop a fight, as one of the white cops inside actually admonished him for shooting at what was probably just a poor hiker, and that he needed to be more careful or he'd get in trouble. When James had shouted about what had been happening to my grandmother, the cop had said, an Indian girl should feel flattered about getting a man's attention, and that we were surely exaggerating or taking it the wrong way. That pissed James off more than anything else, my grandmother said, and he promised that if the police weren't going to do anything about it, he would. That night, James set up at my grandmother's house with a bunch of their brothers and cousins, and a few uncles and nephews too, who brought along some of their hunting and guard dogs, setting up some chairs on the lawn. When it got dark out, they sent her inside and told her to get a good night's sleep, that they'd keep a watch at her house every night until summer was over, if that is what it took. At the time, my grandmother says she thought that's what they actually had in mind, and while she has no proof, she now suspects that they'd planned for what happened that night to occur. Sometime late at night, she woke up to the barking of the dogs and someone shouting. She'd crept from her bed to look out the second-story window, and by the moonlight, she saw a bunch of figures running towards the woods. Standing in the driveway under the window, she saw her Uncle Richard, who must have seen her curtain moved as she looked up and gave her a wave, motioning for her to go back to bed. The next morning, my grandmother came downstairs to Richard and a few of her cousins banging around in her cupboards as they made breakfast for everyone, the dogs begging for scraps and getting underfoot. Everyone was laughing and playing around as they talked and gathered in the kitchen. When she asked them what had happened the night before, James only laughed and told her, "Just a good old-fashioned hunt." None of the others would say anything different. No one in town ever saw a man matching the description of my grandmother's stalker again, and she never felt like she was being watched again either. No one ever filed a missing persons report, and neither did any of the campers. Stuff often got left behind back then by campers who didn't have the room for everything they packed, so any equipment the traveler may have brought with him would have been quickly picked up by the people who ran the campground, or even other camping kids who snatched it up thinking it was just abandoned junk. Because of the flippancy of the officer she'd spoken to before, my grandmother never spoke of her experience to anyone outside of the family again. My grandmother likes to think that they just ran the creep out of town, probably tracking him to his car and making sure he left, harassing and chasing him the entire way, or something. Personally, I don't like to think about it. If you enjoyed this video, you know what to do. Now, before I get into the review of these stories, I'd like to give a quick shout out to the subreddit The Chills. I have also opened that up as one of my methods of submitting. If you would like to go to that subreddit, write down your experience and share me the link, that would be greatly appreciated. The reason I say that is yesterday's Craigslist story was from one of the moderators of that site. He has given me permission to use his story in the comments as well as sending me an email notification. He's also given me permission to post some of my videos in there in hopes to help build the subreddit. He's been working really hard on it, so if any of you like to read stories or even want to submit one, it would be really awesome if you'd head over there and show some support to them. I'll have a link in the description for their subreddit. So the first story, submitted by Cinderella, that's something that's been happening quite frequently, and she brings up a very valid point. You can call the police no matter where you're at. You don't have to wait to be within range of them. Even if you tell them which way you're going, about which mile marker, they can usually catch up. So if you ever find yourself in a situation like that, don't be afraid to call the police. Now that should also be said, if you're being pulled over at night by an unmarked police car and you're fearing it might not actually be an officer, you can actually call the dispatch desk and tell them you're trying to confirm that it's an officer, because not all of the time it is an officer. You can go buy the lights right now for like $700. Yes, they're illegal, but that doesn't stop people from murdering people when that's illegal. Always make sure you think safety first. If you ever feel like you are truly in danger, don't hesitate to call the police. The worst that's going to happen is they're going to say, "No, you don't call the police for that." But most likely they're just going to say you're an idiot and leave. Or they're actually going to save your life, which is what you're hoping for. So don't be afraid to give the authorities a call. Yes, a lot of people don't look at them highly anymore due to all the current events. But just know, out of all the officers out there, more than half of them are good people. But there are always shitbags. So let's just hope you don't have to deal with that one. Now the story is submitted by Lee and their grandmother. That was a great story, and thank you both for submitting. I really appreciate it. I would be really frustrated too, especially since the police seemed pretty damn racist. I'm not sure exactly where they were, but either way, the police, I would hope, shouldn't have reacted like that, but about, especially when it was the older time. So today we've got a very special collaboration, getting everyone worked up for Halloween's. We're working